You can tell I'm not Australian. I just don't have the accent for it. I'm actually was born in New Zealand. But I've lived most of my life in Canada, and of course there's a few differences when you live in Canada versus living in Australia or New Zealand. This is a video taken from a Nest camera that sits between my house and my neighbor's house. It's about 5:30 in the morning. This is about maybe a month ago. It's Wednesday. Wednesday is garbage day. And so there's about 4 bears that live in the immediate area. This is one of the smaller ones. And he reliably pops by between 5 and 6 in the morning most Wednesdays to see if I put up my garbage early. Because if you do, he's going to make a horrific mess with it. So that's, I understand you guys have some nasty spiders and snakes and things. This guy's, he's pretty harmless actually. If I'd opened the door and yelled at him, he would have fled. They're timid, they're just garbage eaters. But that's life in British Columbia. Of course, I'm here in the winter time. Normally, up north right now, it's summertime, although it's forest fire season right now. So my wife sent me this photo. That's sunrise near Vancouver, and everything is red because there's smoke being held over the city at the moment. So it's not a bad time for me to be down here, actually, to have managed to avoid the smoke. One thing I've found in Australia and New Zealand that I cannot find back in Canada are these things. I love the Sport Ute. This is awesome, although I'd hate to drive one in the snow. I think that would be fairly frightening. There's not a lot of weight over those rear tires. But, you know, if we want a pickup truck, it's a truck. It's a big thing. But these are awesome. I like everything about them. If you have, how many folks here listen to .NET Rocks? Okay, so well, great, a few listeners here. So most people know me for the podcasts. I didn't start .NET Rocks, my friend Carl Franklin did, which was back in 2002, about 3 years before the word podcast even existed. I was a guest on episode 69 with his second host, a guy named Rory Blythe. I came on as co-host for episode 100, and I think today we published episode 1465. So we're not quite at 1,500 yet, but we're pretty close. It'll be later this year. I also make an IT podcast called Run As Radio, which I've been doing since 2007. So we've done a little over 500 episodes of that. Question at the back.
How long did you plan on doing .NET Rocks for?
Well, I think as long as .NET's doing fine, I'm going to do .NET Rocks. It's a hard thing to stop doing. You know, the great thing about making this podcast is that I get to have conversations with sort of the best and brightest in our industry. Even sometimes I interview Adam as well. And you get to explore a topic for an hour. So I feel like I'm paid to do research, to think about what comes next in .NET and in software development. You know, it's not really a show about .NET anymore as it is a show about .NET developers. And as .NET developers today, it's a very broad reach that we have. And that's where the tablet show came from. We started that back in 2011 when we got a sense that we needed to go more broadly, iOS and Android, you know, what mobile development looked like, what tablet development looked like. So we lit up this separate show. We did it for 3 years and then realized this is just .NET development and rolled it back into the main show. So I can't tell you when I'm going to stop. I kind of like making them. They're a lot of fun. It's a reflex for me just to constantly be thinking about new show topics, and as long as you guys will listen, I'll keep making them. Now I take those experiences, I make them into conferences as well. So if you're inclined to come to the Northern Hemisphere, this September we're doing a show in conjunction with the Microsoft .NET Core team. So as part of their .NET Core 2 launch, we'll be in Stockholm. And in fact, their .NET Conf event, their keynote will be streamed from Stockholm. So if you'd like to be a part of that, I'd love to have you up there. As well, our big show is in Las Vegas. That is at the end of October. The MGM Grand, typically 3,000 people come out to that. It's a very wide-ranging show. Obviously, artificial intelligence is going to be a big topic this year, but we always talk about web development, all the studio topics, as well as SQL Server, SharePoint, a full gambit. So I make a lot of conferences. I get to think and talk and explore software a lot. I wrote my first line of code in 1977. I was 10 years old. Of course, 1977, that's not the most important thing that happened was me starting to write code. The most important thing that happened was Star Wars. Focus on what's important. Also, because it is August of 2017, it is the 40th anniversary of Voyager 1 launching. And so Voyager 1 now, the furthest man-made object that we know of. It's 13 billion miles away. We now have clear evidence that it's actually left the heliopause, that it's no longer under the influence of the sun at all. One of the best proofs that they have is that the cosmic ray detector on Voyager 1 is now tripping about 4 times as much cosmic radiation as it did when it was inside the heliopause. And I really like this thing because it reminds me that some software has to run for a really long time, because upgrading that thing's going to be tricky. And apparently NASA is still keeping a certain number of those old developers around for the work they're going to do in this. And they figure they get another 15 years out of that machine. So that is an old computer and an old piece of software running out there. 1977, the computer du jour, the one that I learned on, was the TRS-80 Model 1. 4K of RAM. Oh, got some fans in the room. 4K of RAM, cassette tape player to store your programs on, a terrible RCA monitor that fried my eyes. And I think on that screen right there, it's actually playing Star Trek. So, and a version of BASIC not made by Microsoft. The level 2 version of this machine was a Microsoft BASIC, but the original one was a tiny BASIC, and it only had 3 error messages. What? How? And sorry. And I still think sorry is one of the best error messages ever, because it's kind of honest, really. I mean, what's object not found but sorry? You know, the only difference is back then it was all command line. You'd say print divide 1 by 0, it'd say sorry, and then give you a new command prompt. Give me the next command. Windows makes you agree that you're wrong. Object not found. Okay. There's no not okay button. You have to agree before you can proceed. So, I mean, that's the difference. Now, and most of us here are developers. You've been developing for a while, so you remember that experience of really taking control of the machine, of the code that you write actually does something. And you get that rush, that superpower rush. And when I did it at 10 years old, I had that rush too. It was the most incredible thing I'd ever experienced. I was down in that Radio Shack after school every day to play with that computer. And it took me years to actually afford my own. But I, for better or worse, through sheer luck really, stumbled into my career before I'd even thought of what a career could be. And I've basically done nothing else. My first after-school job was repairing TRS-80s. And I wrote code and experimented, and that's all I did my whole life. And the upside to that, of course, is that I was able to travel the world. You know, I have a relatively short attention span. I like to explore a lot of different things, and there's so many choices in software. There's a ton of things you can do. I got into doing my own consulting, and I started taking gigs based on it was a country I hadn't been to. So turns out there's a lot of countries. I've been to about 93, and that's still not even half. So lots more to go. Teaching was a good part of that, as well as consulting. The two kind of go hand in hand. And I got a chance to see a lot of the world and explore a lot of different things. And I see that, you know, we in the West live pretty well. We have a lot of advantages, and we kind of forget just how good things are until you get out there and see some of the harder places. I worked a fair bit in the Caribbean. And one of the big challenges on those little islands is hurricanes. How do you build a data center that can handle a hurricane? How can you, well, you know, what are the procedures around all of those things? And you know, the nice thing about hurricanes is they don't sneak up on you. You kind of see them coming. And I did some work for a company in the Cayman Islands that when Cayman got clobbered by Ivan in 2004. Folks have largely forgotten about that because in 2005, Katrina came along. And Katrina kind of wrote the book on bad hurricanes. You know, this is the 9th ward shortly after that hurricane came through. So certainly near and dear to my heart. And what was interesting to me in 2005, and you got to think back, you know, that's only 12 years ago, but that's before the cloud, before the iPhone, before a lot of things. But it wasn't before software developers really looked at how can software help. And I met a guy who wrote an app in the Katrina timeframe for locating missing animals, which, you know, this is a great app. And back then, of course, when they were evacuating people from the hurricane, you couldn't bring your pet with you. And lots of people chose to stay. Like, they weren't prepared to leave their pet behind, which means they got into even more danger and needed to be rescued. But the ones that did leave, often the pets survived. And then when relief workers came in, they found these lost pets, and getting them matched back up with their owners was a challenge and a great software problem. The internet can help here. And so I met this fellow, Grant, who wrote this app and borrowed some hardware essentially to run it as a website, and people were sending in pictures of animals they'd found in various shelters or buildings on the disaster site, and people that had been evacuated and were scattered all over Louisiana and into Texas were checking them to see if it was their animals, so they got to match back up. The problem, of course, is that as Katrina wound down, not that Katrina's ever really been resolved. I mean, there's parts of of the Ninth Ward still haven't recovered years and years later. The software gets lost. It gets shut down. The people need their hardware back. You know, it's not that simple. And so when I met Grant, he'd actually written that app 3 times for 3 different disasters. You know, because there's always a need, and he didn't really keep it around, and they didn't have the old hardware, and so he'd do it again. He got better at it. He got fast at it. But, you know, you start thinking about its best use of time, what you can really do with software in those sort of scenarios, and how you build really sustainable software. And we don't talk about sustainability in our work software very often, because largely we're employed or we're contracted to write the program the first time. And then it's just a race for features and deadlines and cost. You know, you're just trying to get that thing out. And it's only after the 3rd or 4th version, maybe a 2nd team or a 3rd team now working on it, you start to remember, like Voyager 1, some software sticks around a long time, and we should make it more maintainable, and it should be able to be easily taken over by another team, or somebody new can come into it and get a hold of it. That, to me, is sustainability. And when I start thinking in terms of disaster response in software, sustainability is everything. We're always going to have a problem with lost pets or other applications in this space. The challenge is, can we sustain that software and steadily improve it? In my mind, knowing software is eating the world, can't we use our software to also save it? That we can actually get better at our ability to respond to these different kinds of disasters. Now, open source played a huge role in this. As its wave really grew, we recognized one of the powers of using open source is a place to put the software that everybody can see, that doesn't take secret keys, that you can take a copy of if you need it. And so it helped with the sustainability around the software. And that, to me, was an important part of the equation. Not everybody's worked in open source. And open source, I mean, it's not really intended for charity. You know, the origins of open source are more about dev tools. Developers writing things for other developers. They put in a place for developers to see. And if you like that tool and you use it for a while and you see that it's missing a feature that you'd like to have, you add it. And it's sort of I have a good idea on how to make your product better, and you have that series of iterations. Open source is evolving now. Having companies like Microsoft running their entire framework side of open source just makes it a different world. But when you think about charitable open source, it's another layer again. Now I want to change gears a little bit and talk around why open source even makes sense. Now, we're mostly developers in the room, so we're not surprised at the open source world. But it's a very interesting conversation to have with non-developers. Let me explain this to you. I have friends who are software developers, and they work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, writing code all day for pay. And in the evenings, they go home and they write more code for free. And to the outside world, that seems completely insane. But we know it happens. It happens all the time. In fact, an awful lot of the internet is driven by this free, this donation, this open source mentality towards giving knowledge and skills. And it confuses people as to why that exists. And if there's the best book I've ever read on this subject, it's written by Daniel Pink. It's called Drive, and I absolutely recommend it to your reading. Because he talks about the fact that in intellectual pursuits, in this thinking world of work, money is not a primary motivator. I mean, money's important. We need to be able to live. We need to be able to take care of our families. But at a certain threshold, more money doesn't result in more work. In fact, money can even become toxic. And you've run into employers who have developers who have deadlines they want to meet. It's like, if I pay you more, will you go faster? It doesn't actually work that way. And Pink really dives into this to say, once you get the basic costs off the table, once you have a fair wage, there are 3 things that motivate you that have nothing to do with money. The first is autonomy. So autonomy really speaks to this idea that I want to work on what I want to work on when I want to work. I think as a responsible employer, it's very important for us to have our people own their problems, own the project that they're working on, have a stewardship, which is a task with a responsibility, so that they can choose how they want to work and where they want to work, just get to the results. Years ago, I was part of a startup called Strange Loop. We made an appliance for making websites go faster. And most of our developers worked from home, and they came into the office on Fridays for code reviews. We liked them working from home because it allowed them to focus on their thing, but we also gave them a lot of autonomy. You know what your milestone is, you know it needs to get built. As long as you deliver it on Friday, that's fine. I knew there was a couple of guys we were working with who were big World of Warcraft fans, and they might do a 4-day burn Saturday to Tuesday playing World of Warcraft nonstop. But on Wednesday and Thursday, they'd crank on their code to deliver their milestone on Friday to the team. That makes you happy? Knock yourself out. That's autonomy in my mind, that you're working on the things you want to work on the way you want to work on them. Beyond autonomy, mastery. Because I think everybody gets autonomy. That, yeah, we all want a certain sense of independence. In fact, I know a lot of software developers that started their own businesses purely for the autonomy. Not because they wanted a business, but that they just wanted to work on the things they want to work on. And often I think we're a little deluded about business. You know, you traded in your one boss for a whole bunch of bosses. Excellent. Some of them don't pay you too. But okay, you pulled some autonomy back. So beyond autonomy, mastery. That was the second aspect that Daniel Pink talked about in Drive. Mastery is, I think, a more challenging idea in software, that we like to press against our skills. Mastery is more comfortable to think about if you think in terms of musical instruments or playing music. That no song is ever perfect, that you can always work a little harder, practice a little more, playing your instrument to get better. In fact, Carl, my partner in .NET Rocks, is a really skilled guitar player. And I don't say talented because I really don't like the word talent anymore. Talent to me is something that sort of bestowed you out of the sky. It's not something you earned. I've spent enough time with Carl traveling, seeing him practice guitar virtually every day. Travels with an acoustic guitar, and I've watched him play scales for an hour. Practice his skill. Press against it. So that you sort of see this isn't free. And he doesn't just play a song. He does that unpleasant thing of real practice. I think it's interesting that we rarely do that in software. Generally, we only write the code. We play. Practice is a rarity. In fact, generally, the only time I see software developers practicing is when they say, hey, I know how to do that, and they don't know how, but they're going to learn really fast. That's one way. It's like, MongoDB, I could do that. Just give me a weekend and a book, and I'll get it knocked out. Well, that's one way to challenge your mastery. I think it's fairly hard in the routine practice of day-to-day development to actually challenge your mastery. Because again, we're working under deadlines. And often employers think in terms of, well, you're a front-end dev, so we'll just keep you doing front-end dev day in, day out, day in, make another web page, go crazy. And that can get very frustrating. You know, I find some folks will leave a company just for the opportunity to do something new, a chance to pursue their mastery. So how do we construct an environment where we can allow ourselves to be challenged and allow ourselves to try new skills? I think we've done a number of shows in the area of mastery, which I've really enjoyed. Mark Siemens, a great thinker in this space, if you want to go through the back catalog. He talked about controlling some variables to explore your capabilities, to press against the edges of your skills. So do an Euler problem, sort of classic COM-SCI type problem, where you know what the problem is and you know what the result should be. Now challenge yourself in some way. Now an easy way would be switch languages. You like programming C#? Try it in F#. Practice it. That's a way to practice. It challenges your skills. How about we stay in C# but no loops? That kind of stretches our skills, right? Another way to challenge our mastery, to sort of explore how we code so that we think more broadly about our tooling and what we're capable of doing. I think it's a way that we grow our expertise when we pursue mastery. Now, there's some folks that are happy that they found a way to do something, they're happy to keep doing it that way, and this is not something that incents them a lot. But growing as a developer means challenging your skills, and mastery is an element of that. So autonomy, mastery. The third aspect that Pink talks about in Drive is purpose. Now, I'm working into charity now, so I've got purpose out my ears. But often, especially in software development, we're kind of doing the same thing day after day. It's hard to get terribly excited about forms over data. Although you think about these three elements, you suddenly get why people get so excited about startup companies. Because startup companies tend to be poorly staffed and poorly funded, and so there's lots of autonomy. Do everything or we're going to die. There's lots of mastery. Figure out all the things or we're going to die. And there's lots of purpose. We're bringing something brand new into the world. It gets harder as our companies get larger and more mature and our projects more stable to actually poke on all those different things. But I think it's those three aspects, autonomy, mastery, purpose, that drives so much of open source work as well. That, sure, the work I do at my office is good and I enjoy it, but it's really fun to go pick a project to contribute to in my spare time. I like exercising my skill. That's my little exploration of mastery, is to work on a different tool in a different environment of my own free will to contribute to my community. Autonomy, mastery, purpose. So as I started to construct a charity, I realized these are the three buttons I have to press because I have no money to give. Right? I don't have that option. How am I going to inspire volunteers to actually be involved in this thing? But something more important had happened along the way, and that is that the cloud had come along. Because the cloud gave us a place to put the software. And in fact, disaster response is the ideal case because there's a huge demand for a limited amount of time. And then the demand goes back down so we can wind it down. Owning the equipment almost makes no sense. You know, we all know the cloud is just other people's computers. So the fact that we can have an other person's computer temporarily, and organizations like Microsoft now have created Microsoft Philanthropies where they're literally giving cloud, public cloud for public good. And so working with us at Humanitarian Toolbox, they sort of discovered, yeah, we're a great place to put Azure because we know how to use it. But I think a more important aspect even than the cloud has been the mobile revolution. And we kind of forget just how much power we have in our phones these days. I did the numbers a little while ago, taking a look at that iPad 2 there. So released in 2011, about $600, got about 1.9 gigaflops of compute in it, if you remember the old floating point operations. That, by the way, is the same amount of compute as a Cray XMP supercomputer circa 1985. So Moore's Law works. 26 years later, what used to be a supercomputer owned by governments and universities and modeled nuclear explosions, and the orbital track of Voyager 1, is now a device that your children play Candy Crush on. But what will that do for us in a disaster response scenario? Because we now have this kind of horsepower, can we get it out in the field and empower people to save lives and restore homes? And that's really what Humanitarian Toolbox is all about. So we started this in 2012. It was in conjunction with the Visual Studio 2012 road trip that we did for .NET Rocks. We traveled across the United States, and Microsoft asked us to put in a charitable component to that. And probably would have been easier if I just said match me dollar for United Way. But I was really torn about how hard it was for software developers to give their skills to charity. We've done a few give camps over the year, and I don't know if you've ever seen one of these, but it's like a weekend event. A bunch of devs get together. There's a set of organizers that will contact local charities and find a set of charities that need some software written. Now, for a 48-hour code-a-thon, realistically, you're going to be able to build a brochureware website. And that's fine. That's a useful contribution. And I've found some cases where folks got really hooked on that charity and they kept coming back and adding more code. And when that happens, I think it's very powerful. You know, we're using our superpower to help out a charity. But at the same time, sometimes the teams don't come back. They've got other things to do. They're volunteers. They have the right to wander off. And we all know that software is not free. Software is free the same way a puppy is free. And puppies need care and feeding and cleaning up after. And so the devs may go home at the end of the day, but the charity has to live with the software. The other aspect I saw was that having worked with lots of different dev teams, back in the Strange Loop days, we used to do team building exercises. I'm a big believer in strengthening the trust of a team. How do you make a team better? And I don't feel like work is where we strengthen trust. It's where we challenge trust, certainly a place where we can lose trust. But to actually grow trust, you kind of have to do that out of the day-to-day clicking on the keyboard. In fact, I think in a regular workday, the best chance you have to actually improve trust within a team is lunch. Humans are hardwired to trust people they break bread with or pizza with. In fact, where I've consulted on teams that were, the way you really knew the team was dysfunctional, wouldn't eat together. And I encourage project leaders, plan your lunches carefully. Yes, you should have a lunch with your team once in a while. That's a good idea. But have lunches with other teams. You know, think about the power of that half hour, 45 minutes, hour to really connect with other people, sort of grow some trust. But I didn't feel like that was enough. And so we were talking about after hours trust activities. So we'd go to a soup kitchen. It's a great experience. You know, it's not terribly hard work, but we're all working together. You get to see your team a little differently. You make a good contribution to your local community. Maybe you learn something about the people in your team, a little more trust. We've done it with food banks. I did Habitat for Humanity. Habitat for Humanity was one of the tipping points for me in thinking about Humanitarian Toolbox because I had a great developer. I've got a father who's an electrical engineer, taught me to do electrical wiring at a very young age. So when I do Habitat for Humanity, I'm putting in light switches and outlets and I feel very productive. But here's one of the best back-end programmers I know, and he's painting a fence. Now it's not that the fence didn't need painting, because it did. And it's not that he didn't do a good job. But I think there's more we could do with his skills. And I love the idea that software people could use that software skill, that superpower, to write software that makes a difference. The trick is, how do we make sure we do good with it? Because it's not just about writing the code. So the job of Humanitarian Toolbox was to take that other stuff off the table so that volunteer developers could just worry about the code. We do the project planning. You know, in normal open source projects, we ask you to think of a good idea to add to the project. In Humanitarian Toolbox, everything's in GitHub, but we have a set of work items. We're working with the NGOs to get the project plans together. We just create the work items. You can pick them up and work on them anytime you want. And we live by the mantra that I actually learned from a friend of mine at the Red Cross: outcomes, not outputs. This is an easy trap to fall into, and I think it's something we all deal with, that often we're asked to prove that we're doing something useful, and so we point to an output. I wrote X many lines of code today. That's an output. It's not really an outcome. It may not compile. My function passed all its tests today. Still an output. An outcome is the customer used that feature today and it benefited them. You know, in disaster response, outcomes are pretty clear. Did you save the life? Did you restore the home? Did you get a family back together? Did you find the pet? And we do a lot of output work to get to that outcome. Now, I know my way around software development teams, and I've worked on a bunch of them, and we got inspired to do this, didn't know a whole lot about charity, and didn't know that much about disaster response. So I spent a lot of time talking and meeting with different groups of people. One of the groups that I talked to is Doctors Without Borders, an astonishing, remarkable charity. They have doctors, lots of them, that are willing to volunteer their time to go into disaster sites. They actually have portable hospitals that they set up, trauma centers, able to do surgeries. Remarkable group of people, very interesting to work with. And they're one of the early disaster response charities. I mean, one of the side effects of social media and the internet has been that there's a huge proliferation in disaster response organizations. So 25 years ago, if you were dealing with a disaster, there may be 8 organizations that would show up: International Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, so forth. Today, it can be over 200. And that is very challenging to organize. And while it's great that Doctors Without Borders has the hospital, there's other needs for doctors. Typically, when you're coming onto a disaster site, and I've learned this working with different groups, you have to organize teams, cross-cutting skill sets of teams. So you're exploring a disaster site. You need somebody who's local, knows their way around, knows the language, knows the customs. You need engineers that can evaluate the safety of a building, have a couple of laborers that can move things as necessary, first aid skills, and a doctor if you need to apply medical treatment immediately. And so the coordinators for these disaster sites have to go and pick through all of the different groups of people that are there to assemble these teams and get them out into the field as quickly as possible. And they do a lot of this very manually. This is actually a shot of the Fukushima coordination site. But every picture I've ever seen of any coordination environment, it looks more or less like this: whiteboards covered in Post-it notes, organizing thousands of people if necessary, and then doing their best to coordinate them. So early days of Humanitarian Toolbox, we got involved with the UN, and these days we work with an organization called NVOAD to build a project called the Crisis Check-In Service. And you can see we are a bunch of developers. We're a little low on the UX side. In fact, any UX people out in the room, please help us. But the app is pretty straightforward. Cordova mobile client runs on the Azure in the back end, ASP.NET site. And what we're primarily doing is getting all of those relief workers to pre-populate their skill sets and information so that the coordinator can quickly consolidate that data and organize it. We also provide a mechanism so that folks out in the field, when those relief workers travel out with their phones, can easily report back things they're finding, needs that they find in a particular location. We use GPS location data. And by the way, if you're wondering, hey, it's a disaster site, why does a cell phone work? Turns out it's really actually hard to kill a cell network. It never fully works, but it doesn't fully work in non-disaster times either. But it works well enough. And in fact, even when in areas where they've been fairly heavily devastated, one of the first things to arrive on a disaster site are portable cell towers. And the reason is simple. Where you find a smartphone at a disaster site, you probably find a person who needs help. And so one of the quickest ways to find them is to roll in with these trucks that have generators, expanding mast cellular network towers, and microwave relays, and locate all those phones so that you can get to those people in need. It saves time, it saves lives, and it means we have a network to work from, so the tool like this works quite well. And actually one of the most important features in it is the checkout aspect. When you're dealing with a major disaster site and you're a volunteer relief worker, maybe you plan to go there for a couple of weeks. But you quickly find out that it's not always easy to leave. Not only is there a lot to do, but there's no guaranteed transport out. Vehicles come and go, flights are in and out, and I talked to some folks who were ready to go home, and so they'd pack up each morning from where they were working and they'd go to the airport and see if they could get a seat. And if they couldn't get a seat, they'd go back and work another day, a day after day after day. And they stopped telling people they're trying to leave. Because you get tired of saying, hey, I'm leaving today, and then finding out, okay, no, I'm not, I'm working again. And one of the problems that happens is eventually you do get a ride, and then you're off the site, and people don't know you are. In fact, you even get into situations where they're now searching for you because they're worried you're in danger. And so the checkout aspect, that as soon as you get off the plane on the other side, turn on your phone, the app's like, hey, you're out of the GPS region, can I check you out? Yep, and that notifies the folks back at the site, yeah, you're off, you're good, we know where you are. Challenge of an app like this and working with real disaster relief workers is they're very particular. These are a tough breed of people. And they say things like, how does this beat pen and paper? Because I sure like the battery life of paper. And so making software compelling enough for these folks to use is not an easy thing to do. And the testing opportunities are limited. We work with them as closely as possible so we can iterate relatively quickly, but real trials only come along every so often. So in the United States, FEMA, which is the Emergency Management Group for the United States, holds events. So they will simulate an earthquake in Los Angeles, for example. And that's an opportunity to roll out all the equipment, to do structural tests, to practice first aid exercises, mass scale triage. And if we're lucky, if we've passed the threshold, a few folks will take our app out and kick the snot out of it. Just like every piece of software gets kicked around when the customer gets their hands on it. But we learn, we add new features, we iterate again. This is a project on GitHub. If it interests you, we could use your help. There's development going on it all the time. Let me talk about a different kind of project. This is one we developed with the Red Cross. In fact, already was originally a sample app for Visual Studio 2015 to show off ASP.NET Core, right at the very beginning of all of that. The idea was pretty simple. We're trying to utilize volunteers efficiently. Now, the particular scenario we talk about is around fire prevention. So the Red Cross of the United States hands out smoke detectors to people who need them, that don't have working smoke detectors. But the tricky part with the smoke detector is not owning it, it's getting it installed in the right place. And there's a certification class you can take to actually figure out in a given house where is the smoke going to accumulate first so that you get people as early warning as possible. And volunteer firefighters, construction folks, these are the kinds of volunteers that offer up their time to actually install those smoke detectors. So the Red Cross, in the manual approach, will go to a garden center and set up a table with a sign saying, hey, do you need a smoke detector? And take down names and addresses to get the smoke detectors installed. And once they get a certain critical mass of enough folks in a given region, then they'll bring in the volunteers, give them a stack of smoke detectors, and go ahead and install it. And that can take several months, depending on how the campaign's going. And typically the successful install rate runs around 25%. You send the guy out with 8 smoke detectors and he comes back with 6 of them. People forget, they weren't home, there's a limited amount of control in that, it just takes too long. So the app already allows us to speed that up. We have a campaign engine that's using social media, so we're contacting more people in less time. We're able to coordinate data faster. We have the web client on the phone so we can remotely communicate with the volunteers so they don't have to come in. In fact, as soon as we've got a block of several people in a relatively close region, we can contact the volunteer close and say, hey, are you up for a Saturday? Here's 6 smoke detectors or 8 smoke detectors, get out and put them in. We have Twilio integration, so they're able to say, okay, I'm on my way to this house, and then we'll actually contact the house automatically to say, you know, your installer's on its way, you know, just the way the cable company doesn't. That mechanism, and that got our install rate up around 75 to 80%. This app is in V1 now. It's been in the field for a while. They're using it in a few different places. In fact, coming in October, the Red Cross is going to do a huge push nationwide in the United States to install smoke detectors, and they're counting on our software to actually facilitate. They know they can't do it at this scale manually, so now they're starting to lean on our software heavily. And I hope you think about this program and think, you know, there's a lot of other things we could do with this, because that's exactly what we're thinking about as well. I love the Red Cross. They've helped us a lot, but I'm now talking to several other charities that want to use it for things like flood evaluation, earthquake preparedness, hurricane preparedness. Anywhere where you need a skilled volunteer that wants to use their time efficiently, that an organization can use a piece of software to get folks that need the help and then bring in those volunteers and get them out to do as much work as possible as a day. Don't waste your volunteers' time. I feel that way for my organization, and I love that we build tools that do that for others. Again, GitHub project. Because it's preventative, we're able to iterate really rapidly. Lots of folks exploring with it, testing on it. We've actually had opportunities to farm this software into testing conferences where there's a whole bunch of testers who think testing is fun. In fact, they run competitions where they give away an Xbox, you do the most tests. Those guys write terrible things about our software. They just pound away on it, but we come up with huge rafts of work items. And some of them fairly simple to fix. So folks that have never contributed to open source before, these are easy items to pick up for your first experience of contributing to open source. And we're pretty good about this. The shape that this software comes out at is rather than just one person sort of driving the whole project, most people make a couple of contributions. We run codathons all the time. In fact, coming up in Sydney, this Monday and Tuesday, we'll be working on this project at the NDC Sydney conference. So that's during the workshop days. It's free. We'll feed you lunch. We'll teach you how to make a contribution. And I know in 2 days, I can get a check-in or two for just about anybody who wants to make a contribution to the project. What I'm looking for is people get hooked. This is fun software to work on. It's a really great group of people who are trying to make a dent in the universe. And we have Google Hangouts almost every week now, which is basically a scrum session to say where we're at. Jim from the Red Cross will come in and talk through how they're using the features in the field, and we keep contributing to the project over and over again. So if you go look at our GitHub stats, you'll see the median contribution of the 130 or so people that contributed to already is 3 contributions, 3 check-ins. But the top 20 are all over 100. But no one person dominates the project as a whole. It's a group of people who feel like this is a good way to spend a Wednesday night. We used to go bowling on Wednesdays, and now we write code for already. And I rounded up the pictures of the contributors to already. It's a lot of people. And we hand out badges. When you make a contribution to a project, we have a Humanitarian Toolbox badge. We also have an already badge, and we have event badges. So there's a little Sydney 2017 badge that you add on to that. And I'd like to tell a story about a particular person in this list, and if he watches this, he will be embarrassed because he's an extremely nice man and the least self-aggrandizing person ever. His name is Steve Gordon. He was one of our earliest contributors. When we were first starting this project a couple of years ago, most of the folks that were working on it were literally people we knew, right? The Microsoft guys had done the initial version for Studio 2015. We'd had a few MVPs involved and so forth, and I talked about it on .NET Rocks. And out of nowhere, a guy from the UK named Steve Gordon checked in, looked at the project, made some comments, picked up a work item, and started contributing. Awesome, that's cool, right? Hey, we got a UK contributor. And then late last year, in 2016, the NDC folks asked me if I would keynote the London conference about Humanitarian Toolbox, and we would do a codathon in London. And Steve was super excited. He's down in Southampton. It's like, it's a 2-hour train ride up. I'll take a couple days off work. I'd love to work with you guys and actually contribute the code. Boss wouldn't give him the day off. He was literally going to take vacation days to go. So we talked about it for a little while, and I eventually got on the phone with the CTO, and I don't know if you've met me, but I'm fairly charming. So we got his whole team to come out. Well, here's the conversation I had with the organizer, because I I've been that guy. I've run dev teams. We've got deadlines. This is an important person. I can't have him away for 2 days. My conversation was, I bet you have a recruiting problem. It's like, I'm going to take care of 3 problems for you in 2 days. The first is corporate citizenship. You want to be a good contributor to your community. You want this to be part of your routine of how do we give to charity. There's many ways to do it. I want you to do it any way that makes sense to you, but this is one of those ways. I know you want to strengthen your team, that an opportunity for them to work on something that isn't bound to the work deadline is a way for them to explore each other, to understand each other's skills, to grow a little. We're going to use leading edge bits, stuff you probably can't use your customers yet, ASP.NET Core. So they're going to press against the edges of their skills as well. And it's a heck of a recruiting mechanism. To meet other developers in an environment like this and show how your team works together and say, hey, wouldn't you like to be part of this team? And in fact, after this event, they started doing their own codathons from their office every other month or so and inviting the local community along, and managed to get a few more great devs as part of their team. So for taking a couple of days and picking up the travel costs, their team had a great experience, they made a substantial contribution to the community, and they found a way to wear their culture on their sleeve so that other people could see we're about more than the forms over data code we write day in, day out for our customers. We also work on other projects, and we enjoy each other, and we build good software. And that's Steve that did that he really created that opportunity. We get a chance to all remind ourselves we have a superpower. We forget, but we have this power, and now we have an opportunity to use it for more. And I hope you are thinking that way as well, that there's a lot of code we could be writing. I've only mentioned 2 projects so far. What's happening now is we have more and more projects coming online is we're starting to find charities that have internal software that they're willing to share with the world, but they need more work done on it. So we're going to have some brownfield apps coming into the Humanitarian Toolbox. We're going to open source them. We're going to allow people to contribute to them. We're going to let anybody use them that wants to use them. If you'd like to look at the software, it's on GitHub under HTBox. That's my Twitter handle. That's the charity's Twitter handle. We are a registered charity. If you want to make a donation, we'll happily accept it. But we need your skills more than anything. And I happily answer any questions about this. But thank you so much for your time.